How's it going, guys? Welcome back to another exciting video. And in this video, we're going to go ahead and see how we can actually send off this API request to our backend and then have our backend communicate with ActiveCampaign to actually add this person as a contact, add them in our email list, and also add them into that automation. So we're going to see how to do all these things inside of this video. So let's go ahead and get started. So first thing I want to do is I want to kind of check out this ActiveCampaign documentation. So search up ActiveCampaign API, click the first link you see. That's going to bring you to the API documentation for ActiveCampaign. And the part that we're interested in is in this whole contacts section. So I'm going to go ahead, click in here, and then this is where we're going to be basically working out of. All right, so here we are in the contacts section. And then here you can see how you can create a contact. So that's one handy thing. But there is one kind of like problem if you use this create, because if, let's say, someone goes and signs up, but they already have, or I guess like they already are a contact, you're going to get this 422 unprocessed entity. So there's actually a better endpoint that we can utilize, and that's the create or update contact. If it ends up actually loading here, this is running very slow for some reason. And then basically that endpoint is this right here. So you make a request to this endpoint. So this is like a API/3/contact/sync endpoint, and then you pass in the correct data. And then basically that data is going to be some kind of JSON data where you have your contact, and then you're going to pass in like the email. The email is the only required thing you have to pass. All this other stuff is optional. So in my case, for my newsletter sign up, I had the, oops, I don't know why this scrolled me up, but anyway, we have like the email and we have the first name. That's the data we're passing. And then we're going to utilize that data, pass it along in this request, and that's going to go ahead and create for us. So let's go ahead and like get started on this first. So I'm going to go back inside of my ActiveCampaign, and then essentially the place I want to go to is in my settings. So that's the first place. So that way I know like what in fact is the API that I'm supposed to be accessing. So like this part right here, because we have the endpoint, but now how do we see like what do we pass here? So if you go into your settings, that's essentially where you can find that. There's going to be a section called developer. And if you click on that, you can basically get these values. All right, so once we're inside of here, we see that developer section. So click on that, and then that's what we're going to go ahead and make use of. And then here you're going to see that URL and a key. So we have to use these two pieces of data. So essentially what I'm going to do, so let me close up everything. So right now I have VS Code open with my front end and back end. So I want to go to my back end. I want to open up newsletter because that's the name of my project. I want to go in settings. And I want to create two settings so that I can kind of make use of them. So I'll put them at the bottom. So one's going to be for this like URL endpoint, so that way I can have like reference to it inside of my settings. So let me go ahead and copy this. I'm gonna go back here, and then I'll call this something like ActiveCampaign URL endpoint or something. Or I'll just call it URL. And then I'm going to set that equal to this right here. And then I'm going to have ActiveCampaign key. And then that's what I'm going to set equal to this key, because essentially we have to utilize this key in order to send these requests. And also because this key is something that should be kept secret, that's also why you want to like do all this API communication with ActiveCampaign through your backend. You don't want to like expose this kind of stuff inside of your front end. So now with these two settings, I can basically make use of them inside of my view. So let me go ahead and import settings. So at the top, I'll do from Django.conf import settings. And then let me make two variables which are going to hold these values. So I'm going to do ActiveCampaign URL, which is going to be my settings.ActiveCampaign URL. And then I'm also going to have ActiveCampaign key, which I'm going to set to settings.ActiveCampaign key. Then that way I can utilize these two variables inside of this view. So let me go ahead, save that. And that's essentially all I needed inside of here. So now let me go ahead and check out this endpoint. So this is the one I want to hit. So I'm going to copy this, and then let's go back. So inside of here, after I check if they agreed and whatnot, I'm going to set this URL, and then I'm going to basically be hitting this endpoint. And then I want to use this ActiveCampaign URL. So that's going to be that first part plus this endpoint. So that's going to be that. I also want to pass some kind of like JSON data. So let me go ahead, copy this whole like contact part. This is like the only essential part. Like these field values I don't really care about. So let me actually just copy this. So the email, first name, contact, and then we're going to adjust this. So I'll paste that in here. And then I need that closing bracket. I also like to use single quotes, so let me highlight all of this stuff and use single quotes instead. So this data is going to have contact, which is going to be a dictionary with the email right here, and then the first name right here. So this email we are receiving, and we have reference to it right over here, and we also have reference to the first name. So that's all coming from the data. So let me go ahead, pass in email, and then also pass in first name. So there's that. And now how do we actually make a request to this? So that's kind of like the next step. And essentially you want to make use of the requests package. So let me actually go ahead and just like install that right now. So inside of my terminal where I have my backend, I'm going to do pip install requests. And then I can use this in order to make these API requests essentially. So there is somewhere in the documentation where it kind of shows this. Oh yeah, actually it's right here. So perfect. So basically what you want to do is you want to import requests. You're going to have your URL, and then you basically use requests, and then you're going to make, in our case, a post request to like do this create or update contact thing, and then we're going to basically go from there. So let's go ahead and start doing this. So let me first of all see if that imported. It did. So let me go ahead and do a python manage.py run server just so I can have this running while I'm writing code, see if anything's going to go wrong. I also have a bunch of migrations. I'm not going to be worried about that right now. So at the top, let me import requests. Let me also close up that side window so we have more room here. And then inside of my view, I'm going to go ahead, make a response variable, which I'm going to set to requests.post. So I'm going to make a post request. I'm going to pass in the URL. I'm going to have this JSON, which I'm going to set equal to my data. And then I'm also going to have headers, which I'm going to set equal to some headers. So let's make these headers. So I'm going to have an accept header, which is going to be application/JSON. And I'm also going to pass some JSON content. So I'm going to have content type, which is going to be application JSON. And then I also need one more thing that I pass in here. And let me see if they actually show this. It's somewhere inside of the documentation, but there's basically also that token. So I believe it's inside of this authentication area. Yeah, here it is. So you also have to pass this API token field, and then you pass your token. So let me also do that. So API token, and then this essentially is going to be my ActiveCampaign key that I pass in there. So with that ActiveCampaign key, I can go ahead and make these requests. So I'm going to set headers equal to my headers, which is all of these here. All right, so that's basically the first step. So this is going to go ahead and make this response. And then that's going to go ahead and add this contact. And then from there, I have to do a couple of checks. So let's go ahead and see what these checks are. All right, so right below here, let me do an if check. And then I want to basically check like the status code of this response. So I'm going to do response.status code. That's how I access that. And I want to see if it's not equal to 201 and if response.status code is not equal to 200. Because essentially when this contact's created, a successful response is going to be 201. And then if they already are there and it updates, it's going to be 200. So if it's neither of these, I know that this failed, and I'm just going to return an error response. So let me do return response where I have some kind of error. And it's just going to say like something went wrong when creating contact, let's say. And then I can have like a status of status.http 500 internal server error, let's say. So I can have something like this. And then if we pass this check, then that means we added our contact. And then the next thing I want to do is basically receive the data. And then I'm going to store that inside of a variable called contact. And I'm going to receive that data with response.json. Now this is also a method, so make sure to invoke this with the round parentheses, so that way we get access to that data. And then I want to go ahead and get the contact ID, because that's something I'm going to be utilizing in these requests. And then I can extract that with contact, and then I want to access contact, and then I want to access ID. So let me go ahead and kind of like demonstrate this. So inside of that contacts section, let's go ahead and take a look at this data. So if I go down, like we see this field values, that's one piece of data, but we also have this contact piece of data. So essentially when I do this contact, or I guess this response.json, I can basically go ahead and access that contact. So that's this data right here. And then from there I have different things I can retrieve, like the email and like these other things. But if I go down, whoop, not too far down, I also have access to the ID. And then that's something I want in order to be able to do like other things, like add them to a list. So that's also another thing we're gonna see. And then even tags as well, because I also wanna add a tag. And then when you do these things, like basically you're passing in JSON data where the contact isn't like their name or email, it's like their ID. So that's why we need access to that ID. So with that, let me also do like a try except, just in case if something goes wrong, but nothing should. And then what I'm going to do is return some kind of error response if something does go wrong. So I'm just going to copy this response, paste it in here, and then I can do like something went wrong when, I don't know, getting contact ID, something like that. And then also I want to make sure that this thing's a string. So I'm also going to wrap this inside of the string function. And then that way, this value, this ID, is stored inside of contact ID as a string. So I don't have to worry about that after this point. And now the next step is to go ahead and utilize this contact endpoint. So let me go ahead, do URL is going to be equal to this ActiveCampaign URL, which is basically, well, I kind of went over that inside of the settings. That is this right here. And then the endpoint we want to hit is this right here. So /API/3/contact tags. This is how we create, or I guess like add a tag to this contact. So let me go ahead, put this in here. I have to wrap this in quotes. So that's going to be the URL. We're also going to have some kind of different data. So let me go ahead, set data. And then I want to copy this stuff. I'm going to go back, paste it in here. This is going to be our data. So let me make all of these single quotes since I like single quotes. So we have to pass the contact ID. So we have access to that right now through this contact ID, and it's a string. So I can do contact ID. And then I also need the tag. So this is something I went over before. And essentially inside of ActiveCampaign, like that first tag you create, it's going to have an ID of 1. This is kind of like a review. And then if you add another tag, that's going to have ID of 2. But like one thing I kind of went over, and this is kind of tricky with ActiveCampaign because you can't directly see the ID of the tag. You kind of just have to have like a mental record of like what the ID is. And what's tricky is, let's say if you create a tag for the first time, it has an ID of 1. Then you delete that tag and you add another one. That, even though you have one tag there, it doesn't have an ID of 1 anymore. That one would have an ID of 2. But anyway, I didn't do this sort of deleting thing. So right now, I have one tag, and that one has the ID of 1. And that's like my free ebook tag that I have. So this right here would have this data. And then the last step is essentially to make this like request. So once again, just to make this easier, let me copy this response. And then I'm going to paste it right below here. So response is going to be requests.post. I'm going to pass in this URL. So this is my updated URL, which is going to do the creating of the tag. Then I'm going to pass my data, and I'm going to pass my headers. Now my headers, I don't have to adjust. These headers are going to be the exact same for all of these requests. I'm going to have the accept, the content type, and the API token. And then that's going to allow me to do all of these different things I want to do. So this right here is going to go ahead, make this request. I'm going to get my response back. And then from there, I can once again check the status codes of these things to make sure that everything worked okay. So I'm going to do if response.statuscode. And then I want to check if it's not equal to 201. And if response.statuscode is not equal to 200, just like before. And then if this is the case, then I'm going to return an error response. So let me copy this one, put it in here. And I'll say something went wrong when adding tag to contact. And then that'll be a 500 internal server error if this ends up happening. So that's going to go ahead, handle that for me. And then my next step is to basically add them to the list that I want to add them to. So let me go ahead and do this whole URL thing again. So I'm going to copy this, paste it in here. And then as for this endpoint, it's going to be different. So let's go ahead and find what endpoint we need to hit to add someone to a list. So let's find the lists section. It's right over here. So I'm going to go ahead, click on this lists. And then here we can see how we can, or actually this is how to create a list. I want to see how to add someone to a list. So let's see where that was again. Here we are. So we have this like update list status for a contact. So that's essentially what I want to make use of. And then this is going to add someone to a list. So we're going to hit this endpoint here. So API/3/contact lists. So let me put that inside of here. So that's going to be my endpoint. And then I want my data, which is going to be this right here. So I'm going to copy this part. So we're going to have contact list. Then we're going to have the ID of the list. So I have two lists. My first one with ID 1 is like my master list. And then I also have that like eBook list, which is going to have ID of 2 in my case. And then you also want to pass the contact ID and the status. And then you can also take a look at what these values are expected to be. So they're all expected to be strings. And then the list is required, the contact's required, the status is all required, and they're all going to be strings. So with that knowledge, let's go back here. Let's have our data once again. I'm going to paste in what I expect. And then let me use single quotes here. So I'm going to select all of these, put in my single quotes. So I'm going to have my list. Now the list, I'm going to put ID of 1. That's going to be my master list. Inside of here, I'm going to have my contact ID. And then for the status, I'm going to have a status of 1. And that's essentially going to make them like active inside of that list. And then my next step is to go ahead and make this request. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to make this request. And then we're going to have the response stored in this variable where then I can check the status of it. And then essentially for this, I'm going to go ahead and check just like before whether I have a status code of 201. Or I mean, not if I have one, but if I don't have one of 201, if I don't have one of 200, then I know that something went wrong and then I can send an error response. So let me go ahead and copy something like this just because I'm going to do the same sort of thing. I'm going to paste it in here. And then I'm just going to say something went wrong when adding contact to list. So essentially, this right here is going to deal with adding them to my master list. So maybe I'll do like adding contact to master list. And then I'm going to redo this whole process, except adding them to my next list. So I'm going to have the same URL endpoint, just my data is going to be different. So let me go ahead, copy from here down, go below, and paste. So I have my same endpoint, so my URL is the same. As for my data, all I need to adjust is list ID of 2. And then I'm going to go ahead and make this request. I'm going to check the status of it, and then I'm going to do eBook, or maybe I'll do it like this, eBook list. So something went wrong when adding contact to eBook list. So there we are. That's going to be our final check. And then essentially, right here is where I'm going to have some kind of like else case. And then, and then that's going to go ahead and have my success response. So if everything goes okay, we have our success response. And then one final thing I want to do, just in case, you don't really have to do this, but I think it's good to do it just in case if anything goes wrong during this whole process. I'm just going to wrap everything inside of here, inside of this try. So let me go ahead, highlight everything inside of this logic. All right, so I'm going to indent everything over. Then I'm going to do except return response with some kind of error. And I'll just say something went wrong on our server. I don't know, doesn't matter. Then I'll have a status, which is going to be my 500 internal server error status. So I'm just going to copy this one, put it in here. And there we are. Now we have our endpoint in place for doing all this logic with ActiveCampaign. So let's do a little overview of what's going on in here. So first of all, we're retrieving these 3 pieces of data: the first name, the email, and the agree. We convert the agree to a Boolean value, and we check whether it's true. If that's the case, we're going to go ahead and continue on and not return some kind of like 400 bad request response. We're going to have our first URL endpoint. This is going to be for creating/updating contact. And then we're going to pass in this URL, this data with these headers into this request.post because this is a post request. If we pass in that URL, then we set to this JSON this data, and then we pass in the headers, and that's going to go ahead and create this contact for us. Then we're going to check the status of that request. So if it's not a 201 response or a 200 response, then we know something went wrong during this process, and we can just return from our server some kind of error. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and retrieve that JSON data. We're going to extract the contact ID. That way we can utilize that in the next requests. And then we're going to go ahead, hit this endpoint, which is going to do our adding of the tag to contact. And then we're going to pass in the correct data for that, which is this right here, where we're going to pass that tag with ID of 1 to our contact. We're going to check the status of this process, see if we successfully added that tag. And then we're going to go ahead, hit this endpoint, which is going to add contact to our master list and ebook list. So that's kind of like our next step. And then if you remember with our automation, whenever someone's added to our ebook list, they're also going to be added to our automation. So with that, we can essentially have them added to the automation where they're going to receive an email, and then everything should work out from there. So yeah, that's going to be everything then for this backend endpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and put a pause in this video, and then in our next video, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this whole series and then implement this functionality on our front end and then see us actually being added to the ActiveCampaign email list. So that's going to be everything for this video. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure to leave a like on this video if you did. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this kind of content. Also hit that notification bell to receive notifications whenever a new video comes out. Also, I have links in the description for the Facebook page and Facebook group, so you can go ahead, like that, join the group, and then that way you can reach out to me personally if you have some kind of general questions on web development, app development, or on a tutorial I've created. And anyway, that'll be everything for this video, and I will see you guys in the next.